Hello and welcome to the Discover History YouTube channel. Now we're starting to hear that they are easing the lockdown restrictions, so hopefully, fingers crossed, we'll be able to go back to working normally face to face with people again instead of talking through the amazing power of modern technology basically. We did have a discussion, that's myself and Helen did have a discussion, and we did say after lockdown and when everything gets back to normal, shall we stop doing YouTube videos? Well, actually, we have decided that after the restrictions go, we are actually going to continue with our YouTube videos, and we will also get out and about as well. So we'll be doing videos when we're on site at living history events, and we'll also do some around Worcester where we do our guided tours. So hopefully we'll soon get back to doing normal things. In other words, our guided tours, our school workshops, talks, and all the extra things that we do. Bit of advice: go on our website and have a look, and you'll be able to see all the different things that we actually do. Helen's been working extremely hard getting all the amendments and alterations in pictures ready for a major relaunch, which should be happening on Monday, believe it or not. That soon. She has been working unbelievably hard. Anyway, getting back to this evening, one of our most popular walking tours is actually a crime and punishment one. We also do two other very similar tours. One is Murder in Mayhem, which as it sounds is quite an horrific one. And then we also do Saints and Sinners, which is actually looking at two sides of a coin. The sinners in Worcester and those that are heavenly and saintly in Worcester. So this evening I thought I'll give you a little overview to criminal activity in Worcester years ago, but more importantly, how people were brought to justice in that era, in the past, in the Victorian period mainly. So if you have a look at it, throughout history, we've always had someone in charge in dealing with criminals. For example, we used to have, the Shire Reeve, which later became in modern English as such really the sheriff, and there was also mayors and aldermen of the city that would also mete out all the different justices and things like that. But eventually, when you get to the Georgian period and then into the Victorian, we have what we pretty much have today really: the true jury, the judge, the courts, and so on. And it's interesting because that's also the era when we get proper policing, because prior to that there were Charlies or watchmen. The reason why they were called Charlies, by the way, was mainly down to the fact that they were first employed by King Charles II, and they were watchmen, people that would stand on street corners late at night and make sure people were not doing anything they shouldn't be doing. But the interesting thing is, I find, is that Worcester formed a city police force before an act of parliament ordered it to happen. And this is a photograph, a famous photograph, one of many, of Worcester City Police. Now I'm going to emphasise that, Worcester City Police, because later on there was also a constabulary that was county based. So we're very much like London there, where you have the police of the square mile in the city of London, but then you also have the Metropolitan Police as well. It's quite interesting. Worcester had the two. But in 1833, Worcester formed a police force way before it was a legal requirement, and this was taken outside the Guildhall. And you're probably not recognising the Guildhall. It's actually taken at the back of the Guildhall, and there are a few peculiarities, shall we say, because the staircase that these are stood on goes that way. Well, we know for a fact from the amount of times we've been in and out the Guildhall, the staircase now goes the opposite way, which is a peculiarity. I do like looking at old photographs. However, this is the police force, and what I would draw your attention to is their fine spiked helmets. Now, they didn't always have spiked helmets. They did have normal 8-panelled cork helmets really for a very, very long time. But around about 1880, it was the latter period of the 19th century, they suddenly have these spiked helmets, very much like the military had at the time. And they also have all over their uniform, in buttons and badges, the Worcester City coat of arms. And luckily, whenever I portray a policeman, I usually portray those. And my uniform was made by a costumer, and the person that made it, the seamstress that made it, went by some original Worcester City Police uniforms that I was fortunate to have a look at their headquarters. And it is an interesting uniform because it really shows civic pride before you get the big constabularies later on. So if you were in Worcester years ago, you would probably, if you were doing something wrong, get arrested by the sheriff, the Shire Reeves, all these other people, the Charlies and so on, the watchmen. But from 1833, Worcester City had its own police force, and you would have seen these wandering about keeping law and order, and they could arrest you and throw you in the lockup. But later on, when we get all the acts coming in, forcing governments to form, or forcing the country to form constabularies, we then get the Worcestershire Constabulary, and this is one group of people of the Worcestershire Constabulary, and these are the ones based at Howes Owen. People often think Howes Owen is not part of Worcestershire. It's the same with Dudley. Well, it isn't today, but it was at the time, and this is a group of Worcestershire Constabulary policemen, and these come along in 1839, and sadly these get swallowed up in 1967 by the new formation of what we have today, which is West Mercia Constabulary, the police force that operates in Worcestershire even to this point. Now, if you were arrested, you would probably end up in court, and the courts in Worcester was predominantly the Guildhall for a very long time, and later on we get a magistrate and Crown Court, which we still have today in Foregate Street. And if you were going to be sent down to prison, for example, then very simply you could be sent to one of two prisons. Now, Worcester had a prison or lockup for a very long time. We know that in the medieval period, people were often locked up in the sheriff's basement. If you don't know where the sheriff lives, that's what is King Charles's house. And if you ever had a drink in there, or one of their famous pies, they still have a dungeon or a cellar that would have been used to store prisoners in. Or later on in the castle, even, we kept people in there. But we do have two prisons in Worcester by the period of the Worcester City Police and the Worcestershire Constabulary. First of all, we have this one. This was built in 1824, and this is the Worcester City Jail. Now, I don't know if anyone knows where this is, because the street is still there, and there is a building on this photograph that you may recognise. I will draw your attention to this building here, and that's because it can still be seen today, and it's right next door to the Greyfriars, the National Trust property in Friar Street. This road coming off here is actually Union Street, so this was Worcester City's own prison. So let's say you were arrested in 1833 by Worcester City Police. You were sentenced for prison. You could end up in our very own jail. It's not the biggest of jails, really, but it did famously have a treadmill. The only problem is, by 1867, they closed it down, unfortunately. But we do have another one. Now, the next prison that we have is the one that stood in Salt Lane, and this is the prison. This is Salt Lane, and it goes down just off the photograph. It starts to drop, and it drops down into the racecourse, Worcester City Racecourse. Now, we don't call this Salt Lane anymore. We actually call it Castle Street. So this is taken from the top end of Castle Street, right up by Foregate Street in the Tithing, and it's looking down Castle Street, or Salt Lane as it was called. And the reason why they changed this street to Castle Street was down to the fact that the jail did look like a castle. So that's why we have the name Castle Street, because there was definitely no castle here. The castle was actually at the other end of the city on the site of the King's School. But it was a huge county prison. And it started life in 1813, so it's a very old prison anyway, and they kept adding to it, and it went right up to 1922. 1922 was when it ended, but the buildings were not all knocked down at that point. They continued way after, for example. But it was a fine prison. It was the place where they carried out executions in the Victorian era. What they used to do is they hanged people between the two towers of the gatehouse there, and then eventually when the bodies were taken down, they used to be taken over the road, because over the road was, and still is today, the infirmary, which is now part of the city campus of Worcester University. And the infirmary was actually a teaching hospital, so people were taken in there and dissected, which was allowed. It was a legal thing, really, in the Victorian era. Some people hated the sight of bodies being taken over the street, and famously they did construct a tunnel that went between the prison and the infirmary over the road. So basically the bodies were taken under the road. But we know they used to have huge gatherings when there was a public hanging years ago. When the infirmary was taken over in more recent years by Worcester University, one of the fastest growing universities in Britain, there was archaeological digging going on in the grounds of the university, and they did find a number of pits that contained all sorts of body parts, random body parts, and a lot of them had holes drilled in them. There was also marks of copper rings holding bones together, and we actually know now that they were body parts of humans, probably from the prison, where they were actually defleshing them and then having them as skeletons, for example, for teaching. And that's why we have the holes drilled in them to hold them together. It's quite a fascinating thing. So Worcester had its own police force from 1833 before it was a legal requirement. We then have the Worcestershire Constabulary, and like I said, all those get swallowed up by what we have today, which is West Mercia Constabulary. And if you were going into prison years ago, you may go into the city prison that lived or had an existence from 1824 to 1867. That's now Laslitt's Almshouses. Or on the site of the old car dealership, which is also owned by the university now, in Castle Street, we had the county prison from 1813 up to 1922. But eventually it was all knocked down. And it's quite sad, really, because this would have made a fantastic museum in its day. So hopefully that's been a little bit, and I mean a little snapshot of criminality in Worcester years ago. And what I might do in a week or maybe a couple of days time is do another video going into a bit more detail, for example on policing, on the prisons in Worcester, or any famous criminal cases. By the way, we aren't all beautiful and angelic people in Worcester. We do have the criminally minded as well. So on that note, stay safe and we'll see you soon. Bye bye.